And couple of things that I want to announce on February 8th. I'll put that up on the board. 2/8. Okay, we will have a panel discussion. Okay, and we're going to have people from different public accounting firms. I'll still see if maybe I can get someone from government to come through, but I don't know, maybe matter, antimatter, the CPA firms and IRS get in the same room, maybe there's an explosion or something, so I don't know. But we'll think about that. But that's going to be on February 8th, okay? So that's now, so see me, Abby? See me after I got an answer to the question, somewhat of an answer, temporary answer. I forgot to talk to you before. So we are going to have that on February 8th, and we'll dedicate the entire class time to it. I think we'll ask them questions for about an hour or so, and then we'll have a little half-hour time afterwards so you can kind of, step up and introduce yourself or whatever. So, you don't have to suit up, but you might want to wear some interview attire, I guess. I don't know. Not suited up, but business casual, I guess, might not be a bad idea. Okay. What else? There was something else. Don't forget, and I'm saying this more for the people that aren't here that might be listening to this now. You got to be here to get the points for the quiz and the homework. And what happened to my class last semester, everybody ended up hating me because I didn't give them points if they weren't here. And then they wanted to say, well, you have to give me the points anyway because I had something I had to do. And I'm not giving points if you're not here. Okay? If you're not here, you're not just getting points for whatever else you're doing that day. So they'll have to be an extensive makeup of some sort or something. So when I start seeing empty chairs, it's real easy on, January 25th to decide not to come to class. It hurts a lot more in May when you're wondering why you're getting a B- in the class, and it's because you didn't get the homework and the points. And people start sending me pictures of their car being totaled and all these different things, as to why they can't be there, and they bring me all these, pieces of paper, and I'm like, those aren't excuses. You gotta either be here, or if you can't be here, then there's a makeup assignment. But you got to do one or the other. Okay, so the panel is on 2/8. We'll dedicate the entire class time to that. Okay. All right. Those are the couple things I wanted to say, I guess, administratively to get us going. So let me go ahead now and put this in slideshow mode for Chapter 2. And we had pretty much got a start on some of the basics here in Chapter 2. So I'm going to take us to where we had started calling out some of the different sources of the tax law. We had a little practice with how to call out different parts of the code. So the code is the law, and it should basically reflect what Congress intended. Although one of the comments that was made to me by a PwC partner was that there's a difference between what they were told was the intent of the regulation, the new legislation, I should say, and the actual code, that what the law is now saying. So that might be a good question to ask about that you heard about that. You don't have to tell them you heard it from me. You could say that you heard about that, and what do they think about that, and they might have some interesting things to tell us. Or you might just ask in general, what are their thoughts on the tax, tax, they call it the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Some people call it reform. It's not reform, because reform is revenue neutral. This actually increased the deficit. But anyway, after you get past the code, then you have these other areas and regulations. Okay, regulations are as authoritative essentially as the code. So they have the force of law. Okay, so these are our final regulations. Okay, now you could also have temporary regulations and proposed regulations. Temporary regulation is something when there's an emergency, they have to get a reg out quickly, but they haven't completely decided what they want to put in the reg. So they'll put a temporary regulation out, okay? And at the same time, it's considered proposed. And if they don't make a final determination within 3 years, then that temporary reg will expire. Okay, but sometimes they'll put something out as a temporary reg, and it may be cited as precedent. Okay, but then it'll eventually come out as a final reg, and when it comes out as a final reg, they will issue that in what they call the Treasury decision. Okay, and so we have our regulations. Revenue rulings are not as authoritative as the codes and the regs. Okay, revenue rulings are when there are a variety of letter rulings that have come out, and they seem to be in sort of in the same subject area, so they'll take a variety of letter rulings which are specific to certain taxpayers that request that, and then they will go ahead and turn those into a revenue ruling, and they're not as authoritative as regulations, however. Okay, and then you have some of these other things. Revenue procedures are administrative. Okay, and actions on decisions are going to be more granular than your Treasury decisions. And as we said last time, oh, okay, here's our letter rulings. I was thinking of letter rulings where they were on this chart. Here they are right here. Letter rulings are specific to taxpayers. They actually ask for the ruling, and they have to pay to receive that letter ruling. And if there are a lot of letter rulings that seem to be dealing with the same subject, then IRS will often come up with a revenue ruling that sort of says, hey, everybody, this is what we've seen in a lot of the letter rulings, and so we're coming up with this revenue ruling. Okay. As we said last time, I mean, the sort of one-stop shopping center for all of this are these private. These are not from the IRS. Okay, these are not, you know, Treasury documents. These are all private research sources that really, that's really your starting point if you're trying to research a particular topic in the law, because what they'll do is they'll organize these all by topic. Most of these things come out, the ones that come out from the government come out in something called the Federal Register. Federal Register is a chronological document in which each day of the year, if they issue something on that day of the year, and it doesn't just deal with IRS, it could deal with all kinds of different laws, that comes out in the Federal Register. So these things come out chronologically. Your best bet for finding them where they're organized by topic is in the research services. Okay. Okay, good. So regulations issued by Treasury Department, okay, but it's really IRS that's doing that as part of Treasury, and they provide interpretations and guidance in the law. When the regulations come out, they can be proposed, okay, which is basically giving you a preview of what the regs are going to look like. They can be temporary, and again, temporary is when they are trying to come out with something quickly, okay? And so they're thinking, hey, there may still be changes to this, but this is what we're thinking the regs are going to look like. And you can use those and use them as precedents until they come out with the final reg. And if there's a difference in the final between the temporary and the final, they put that out in a Treasury decision, then of course you have to follow the final. They are issued as temporary and proposed simultaneously, and if they don't turn it into a final within 3 years, then it expires. Okay, that's probably unlikely that that would happen, but if they sit there for 3 years in temporary status, they expire. Okay. Okay, you can see the reference. We talked about citations for the code last time. And we kind of looked at this last time. It's pretty straightforward in that if you go through the sequence of the code sections are second, and if it's a reg, you'll see a 1 in front of the code section, and that's how you know that it's the reg. Okay. So the regulations are going to give you more detail, force of law, and so a good way to get your hands around a tax issue is probably from the regs. Okay. And again, they can be proposed or temporary, and you can see they're going to put proposed or temporary in there if they are proposed or temporary. So that's pretty easy. Okay, revenue rulings. Again, as I mentioned, this is something that will happen when the IRS has seen a variety of letter rulings that are sort of similar in terms of subject, and so they will finally go ahead and come out with a revenue ruling that they're hoping will sort of answer the question at a broader level, as opposed to have to keep issuing letter rulings for each individual case that is brought to them for a letter ruling. Okay. So you've got your you got your code, you got your regs, you got your revenue rulings, and then you've got these basically these other documents that are going to come underneath this. Okay, and you've got revenue letters as well. Okay. You can also have a temporary revenue ruling as well, and they give us the citation for that example of a temporary revenue ruling, the citation. Revenue procedures, and revenue procedures, the best way to remember this are administrative. When we say administrative, what do we mean by that? Administrative is really getting more into the procedure for how to deal with the IRS, how many days you have to, file documents with them, dates for filing, that sort of thing. So they're not really dealing with the tax law as much as they are saying administratively, this is how long you have to appeal a decision by a revenue agent, whatever. Okay, and so these are procedural. As I mentioned, I work for the GAO, for the Government Accountability Office, for several years, and the things that we looked at tend to be procedural. I mean, we didn't go in and say, hey, IRS, did you follow the law? We were more procedurally, did you give due diligence opportunity to taxpayers, that sort of thing. And so these are more administrative in nature as to the procedures. Okay, and you can see, again, the citations. We're not going to be dealing with citations in here. I'm not going to ask you to use a citation or, anything like that. You will simply see those in the footnotes to the textbook. Often they'll call out the citations like this. Okay, letter rulings. Okay, and had some information on revenue. Letter rulings, I should say, that I had written down. So I want to go ahead and give you some of those things that I saw that I thought were kind of interesting. Okay, actually it's the letter rulings. Yeah, here we go. So IRS, I guess, issues about 2,500 of these a year. Okay, and it's when the taxpayer comes and says, look, we would like you to rule on how we're going to treat this particular transaction for tax purposes. Okay, so they issue about 2,500 a year, and they issue them for a fee, and I'm not sure what the fee is. I don't know how exorbitant it is, but if you're a company, you literally have to pay to get this revenue ruling from the IRS. Okay, now it says here. Okay, let's just take a look at a couple things about those. They offer guidance to taxpayers. Offer guidance to taxpayer on how a transaction will be taxed before proceeding with it. Okay, so if you're going to you're going to do a particular transaction, you need to consider the tax consequences. And if it's an area that you haven't done a lot of work in the past, then you may want the IRS to go ahead and rule on that. Again, it's issued for a fee, and it describes how the IRS will treat a proposed transaction. So I don't know, when companies were first developing apps, maybe they didn't know exactly how those type of transactions dealing with apps for your cell phones and that kind of thing would be taxed. And so they maybe asked, hey, IRS, how would this type of transaction be taxed? And then as that part of the economy grows and more companies are getting into those sort of transactions, eventually IRS might say, you know what, we're going to come out with a revenue ruling on this. Okay, so they only apply to the taxpayer who asked for the ruling. Okay, now what I song that was kind of interesting is you'd think that it's only applicable to this one taxpayer, and so I guess they can't issue these, right? But what I found out is they actually go ahead and they redact them so that you supposedly can't tell who the specific company is, and now IRS is required to issue these, okay, so that you can go and look at some of these letter rulings and see, you don't necessarily know what the company is, but you might be able to back into, how you would treat something based on what you're seeing in that letter ruling, and then you don't have to pay the fee, okay? Now, the problem to me, let's say you're a company and you're trying to figure out how a particular transaction would be taxed. What would be some of the things that you might be concerned about if you go and you ask for a letter ruling? You want to see how something's going to be taxed, right? You're thinking about doing something. You're trying to figure out the tax consequences. So you go to IRS and you ask for a letter ruling, right? You pay for a letter ruling. And IRS is now required to issue those. What could be a problem there? If you were to jump up and say, let's get a letter ruling on this. Yes, sir. Yeah, the concern that I would have exactly that is that, hey, if we go to IRS and we ask for a ruling on this, then what? Then, they're going to issue that, and we may have other competitors that will be able to back into it's us, and they might be able to figure out some, sort of proprietary information on it, right? So it's something to consider carefully before you would just go ahead and do it now that you know that these have to be issued, right? But it is a way of seeing the tax implications, and so it may be cost effective to go ahead and pay for it and take that risk, right? Yes, sir. Yeah, yeah, maybe before you were sailing under the radar, and then you walk in big and bold and say, well, we're doing this, and we want a letter ruling, and they go, oh, okay, thanks, right? Completely unrelated, one time I was on an audit, and I explained to the agency, basically it was VA, how somebody could cheat the system. Employees could cheat the system and actually steal from from the VA, and they were joking, of course, but they went, "Oh, thanks." Now they knew how to do it, right? But of course, I'm sure they didn't do it. But yeah, so the IRS might say, "Thanks for making us aware of this," right? Okay. Okay, good. So those are letter rulings, and they're specific to the company. Okay. All right, good. Now we've had what? We've had the code. We'd have the revenue rulings. We have these letter rulings. We've had the regs, right? And those to me are kind of some of the main things. I mean, we did have the, the procedural ones that we talked about. But in terms of those that are specific to the tax law, so I was like, well, how do I remember the hierarchy of these? And you don't have to use this if you don't want, but I was thinking code regulations. Code regulations are ruling letters. Code regulations are ruling letters. So you have what? You have the code and regulations are sort of on the same level, right? And then what? Then you have these R revenue rulings, and then you have what? Then you have these letters, and letter rulings is what we're talking about here, but a lot of these other things that we're talking about sort of fall underneath the revenue, the code, the regulations, and the revenue rulings. Okay, just one way to maybe help you try to remember some of the hierarchy of these. And it's not a big deal. We're not going to go hog wild on this, but you'll see some questions in the quiz when we get to it that we'll expect you to know the ranking of some of these. But the code rules, right? Codes and the reg is the big one. Okay. Okay, good. And then example of the citation, okay, letter ruling, etc. Other administrative pronouncements, Treasury decisions, okay? And again, Treasury decisions are when there is a new proposed regulation that has been out and they're making it final, or if, of course, they're changing an existing regulation. They put those out and they call it a decision. So it makes sense that if you have a reg that has been proposed and what? They finally go ahead and they issue that as a final. They call that a decision. Okay. Okay. Let's go ahead and we have determination letters. Usually involve completed transactions. Okay, so it's no longer this issue of, hey, it's a proposed transaction, it's a completed transaction, and we're really, when we're going for a determination letter, we're saying, hey, we're done with the transaction. This is questioning what? How should we treat it? How should we file for this? And so that is typically not published, just like, is taxpayer data publicly available? Can you go and download the tax return of Apple? What do you think, Corey? No, right? How do you know the tax data is not publicly available? Huh? Oh, you looked? Oh, okay, yeah. No, yeah, you won't find that. Two things. Our president has refused to publish his tax returns, so it's clearly not published. Every other candidate has published it. President Trump has said no. He's the first one that's just said, no, we're not doing it. Now, I don't understand why the press hasn't asked this question, because he said he didn't want to release his tax returns for years before he was elected president because he said that he was under audit. And so he didn't want to release the return while he was under audit. And I can kind of see that, because if you're running for president, you're the president, and you release your tax return that is under audit, now every halfway accountant in the world is looking at your tax return and sending letters to the IRS saying why you should, be taxed more or something like that. So I could see why, if you're under audit, I don't want the whole world now auditing my tax return and figuring out ways for me to pay more tax. I get that one. What I don't understand is what? He was president in 2017, right? Or, 2017. So he had to file a tax return in April of 2017, right? That would have covered the year 2016. How could he already be under audit when he immediately files the return? You don't know that you're under audit when you immediately file the return. They don't say, oh, we got your return. By the way, you're under audit. Okay? There's some time that they will have to process that, et cetera. So he didn't file the return on April 15th. Talk about administrative procedure, tax procedure. He didn't file on April 15th. And if you don't file on April 15th, you get an automatic extension for 6 months until October 10th. So he told everybody he filed an extension because everybody knows April 15th is tax day, and all the press people say, are you going to release your return? No, I'm filing an extension. But because, the press is not typically tax nerds, nobody sat there and said, well, it's October 15th. How come you're not releasing the return? Because there's no way he could be under audit the same day that he files the return. So release that return. So maybe his excuse would have been at that point, nobody asked the question, maybe it would have been, well, by analogy, people could say things about my return, and that could affect things that are under audit. I don't know. Okay. But no, they are not public, right? Now, just a side story, because as I had mentioned, I was on audit of the revenue cycle for the federal government. So when we're auditing the revenue cycle, I got on the revenue cycle for a few years, and then I got on the refund cycle. Refund cycle was just a footnote, but because there's, billions of dollars that go on the refund, it was material enough that they signed me and a couple staff to just looking at the refund footnote in the financial statements of the custodial statements of IRS. They call them custodial because they're basically collecting the revenue on behalf of the government. So when we were on the revenue cycle, we actually had to go to the IRS service centers and we had to sit there and actually sample a set of tax returns and look to see that the liability that the taxpayer was reporting on their tax return was what the government had put in their revenue system, right? Your liability to the government is the government's revenue. And somebody, a high-level person in my office, decided that it was okay to take his ex-wife's tax return so that he could look at it to see, you know, what her tax return was showing, I guess, to see maybe he could reduce his alimony or something. I don't know why he was doing it. So he puts the thing in his briefcase and tries to walk out, do-do-do. And, you know, when you're trying to do something, remember I said if you're cheating, you sit funny? I guess it was the way he was walking or something. The guards asked him to please open his bag, and bam, here was his ex-wife's tax return. And so I don't know how there wasn't an immediate public firing for that. I think it was because he was at such a high level that they slowly convinced him that he should resign his position. He ended up having to resign the position for trying to get away with that. So, and in our office, if taxpayer, well, my ex-office, if taxpayer data, I guess I'll always be part of the GAO. So if I say our, and I'm talking about GAO, forgive me, it's in my blood now. But in my ex-office, if you had taxpayer data, you literally had to put on your door restricted access. Okay, you can't come in here unless, you know, I've put everything away and locked it up and stuff. So anyway, so that's a little bit about. I don't even know sure how I got on this. Oh, that it's a completed transaction, so since it relates to a potential filing, I think that's why they don't like to publish it. Abby? October, 6-month extension, so it would go to October 15th. Yeah. No, it's an automatic extension. The only thing is that if you owe tax, they want you to pay it at that point. And so let's say you say, well, I don't know if I owe because I haven't filed the return yet, then you should make an estimated payment. And if there's a difference between what you paid and what you owed, of course, you'd get a refund if you paid too much. So you should probably err on the side of paying too much, because if you don't pay enough, you have to pay the interest for the amount that you didn't pay. Huh? Yeah, 6 months interest for the amount you didn't pay. And if you are over certain thresholds, and again, this would be an administrative issue, if you're over certain thresholds of the underpayment, then you could be subject to failure to pay penalty as well, because you know, they don't want you to just blow it off. Oh well, you know, I'll just pay the interest, and you know, meanwhile the government's out $1 million or something, because the interest rates are pretty low. So if you go over certain thresholds as a percentage of the tax liability, then they'll hit you with a penalty for failure to pay. Yeah, but you get an automatic extension. So if you think you got a refund coming, there's no harm at all in filing an extension. It's automatic, and all you have to do is send in. You do have to notify them. You just send in a form saying I'm filing an extension, and you get the automatic 6 months. Okay, that's usually what accountants and CPAs do. Okay, because they're so busy getting through tax return that they don't have time to file their own tax return, so they file an extension so that they have the time to do their own tax return. What is it? Mechanics usually have the worst running cars. Not worst running, but the dirtiest, funkiest cars, you know, because it's like, I'll get this done whenever, right? Okay? Okay, let's take a look at other items here, probably not as significant. Announcement notices, news releases, internal legal memorandum, chief counsel notices, prohibited transaction exemptions. Okay, just sort of a dump here of different items. Okay. Coming over, internal memorandum, and they do not necessarily reflect, indicate that they may not be cited. Okay, so they're not basically authoritative, but they are helpful. Okay, so you can read through those, and the IRS will explain its position on various issues. So even though they're not authoritative, they're helpful. The one that I see a lot are these TAMs, these technical advice memoranda, can be very helpful. Okay, and then there's different publications and that sort of thing that could be helpful. Okay, so those are sort of the documents. You know, the regs and the code being the top. I'm thinking revenue rulings and those letters are probably pretty important as well for us. Okay, so let's just take a look at judicial sources. Okay, so what's going on here? Let's say you file your tax return, and IRS says we've audited your return, and you owe another $50,000 of tax. What would you do? Would you just pay it? Get them out of my face. They say, oh, 50,000. I don't want to get in trouble with the IRS. Just pay them 50,000, right? I mean, it depends, you know, cost-benefit analysis, right? But let's say you're like, well, no way. You know, I think that that was an unfair decision. So you're going to go and you're going to appear before the revenue agent that went ahead and audited your tax return and explain to them why you think they're right and they're wrong. They'll say, no, I still think I'm right. You owe the 50,000. Then what do? Well, then you can do what? You can appeal within the IRS, and if your appeal is denied within the IRS, and again, there'd be a certain amount of times that you would have to appeal. That's the administrative process. You ultimately may say, well, I disagree. I'm going to take you to court on this, okay? And so you can take the federal government to court, okay? And that's after you have exhausted your remedies within the IRS, okay? So it's not like you can just immediately say, hey, I disagree and I'm going to court right away, okay? So after you have gone through and you're still not satisfied, you can go to the federal courts. Now they're talking federal courts here because what? This is the IRS, the federal government. I guess that blue's not too great. Let's do green. Okay, so we're going to go to the federal courts here. Is the green any better? A little bit better. You can see the green a little bit better, right? Okay, so there are 4 courts where your case will originally be heard. Okay, so when you first go to court, you can go to the tax court. You can go to the tax court small cases division, and there's a 50,000 limitation there. You can go to federal district court, or you can go to the U.S. Court of Claims. Okay. Now, if you go to the tax courts, you don't have to pay the tax first. If you decide to go to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims or the Federal District Court, you have to pay the tax first. Now you look at this and you're like, well, great, you know, I have to pay the tax to get out of the IRS loop here on the courts, because many of these tax court judges are former IRS employees and that sort of thing, okay? But the advantage here is what? Advantage is that you don't have to pay the tax, right? So you're going to have to weigh that in your decision. Now, I'm sure there are statistics that are published as to how often these various courts find in the taxpayers, you know, favor as opposed to the IRS's favor. Okay, and that might be a determination as well. Okay, now again, if you go to the small case court, you have the issue that your case has to be 50,000 or less, and the other sort of, you know, maybe problem here is that the ruling is final. You cannot appeal. Okay? You do not have to be represented by an attorney. You can simply do what? You can simply appear as yourself in the tax court. You don't have to have legal representation. Okay? By the way, they say an attorney here, and it does not have to be an attorney. The tax courts will allow you to be represented by a CPA. So if you're a CPA, you have the ability to represent somebody in tax court. The only problem there is that there is no CPA client privilege. So a CPA could be compelled to present their work product as evidence against you. And so that's something to consider, is why you might want to go ahead and bring an attorney, okay? Because attorney would not have to bring their product as evidence, okay? And again, we have these special judges, and most of them are former IRS employees, that sort of thing, that become judges at the tax court. Okay, and this is the small, but you can't appeal. Okay, that's for the small claims. Okay, let's just go over, and I'm going to just go back to the highlighter here in a second and look at the system here. And of course, we just had our what? Small divisions, can't appeal. Okay, small division, can't appeal, 50,000 limitation. Then what? You have the tax courts. You have the what? U.S. District Court. I don't know that I have to put a star next to these. I'm not trying to star them. I'm trying to check them more than star them as we go through them. You have the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Okay. And what's the issue with the U.S. District Court and the Court of Federal Claims? If you want to be heard there, huh? You must pay, right? Good. Must pay the tax. Right? Don't have to pay for the U.S. tax court. Okay, good. Now, you take a look here and you notice that if you do decide to appeal, you can't appeal for the small case division, but if we're talking tax court, we're talking U.S. District Court, you can appeal, and when you appeal at the circuit level, federal circuit level. Now, there are various circuit courts in the U.S. I think there might be 9, and I think the reason I'm stopping at 9 is the one that's relevant to the Bay Area is the 9th Circuit. Okay, and so I'm going to stop at 9. I think it goes by regions of the country, and I think they have the country put in the way the federal government divides up the country. They divide it up into regions. Okay, and there were some people that used to say that if the federal government ever wanted to conquer the states, they would do it by region. If the states tried to rebel and withdraw from the union, the way the federal government would go after them and keep them in the union is by the regions, which is, kind of talk you hear when federal employees start complaining about being in a region. But anyway, I think we're in the 9th region. I know that, and I think that's why it's the 9th Circuit. Okay, so if you're sitting here and you've gone to the tax court or the district court, you're still not satisfied with your decision. Of course, in the case of the district court, you pay the tax first. In the case of the tax court, you didn't pay first. Then you would go to the what? To the 9th Circuit for your appeal. Okay, you'd go to the 9th Circuit for your appeal. Now, it begs the question, well, what would happen? How would I end up in this U.S. Court of Federal Claims? Well, you could appeal through the U.S. Court of Federal Claims regardless of where you are in the United States. And they have these traveling judges that go around to the different regions and stuff. You could go that direction. So why would you decide to go to a U.S. district versus the U.S. Court of Federal Claims? Most of the cases that come through the U.S. Court of Federal Claims are larger corporations. The Court of Federal Claims, well, a couple things. When you go to district court and you go to the Court of Federal Claims, district court and Court of Federal Claims hears more than just tax cases. They are not just restricted to tax cases. So if you're in a criminal hearing of some sort and you decide to appeal, you would appeal to a district court, right? Okay, so it's not just limited to tax. So you're getting outside of tax specialization when you go to the appeal to the, if you take your case, I should say, to the district courts and the Court of Federal Claims. But why would you choose the Court of Federal Claims versus a district court? Because you can go to the Court of Federal Claims even though you're here in the 9th region. Usually it is bigger corporations that take their case to the Court of Federal Claims, okay? Because it tends to have more of a business acumen to it. The type of things that go through the Court of Federal Claims are things like patent violations, those sort of things where there's a suit against the government. They've said you violated a patent and you're going against the government on that. Then you would go for a lot of things through this Court of Federal Claims. It tends to be more business acumen. And look at it this way. Since there's 9 district courts, is it possible that one district court can have a different decision than another district court? It could be possible that the 8th district, whatever, will have, one district court, I should say, they don't number those 1 through 9, that's the circuit. But it could be possible that one district court will have a different decision than another district court, right? So what happens? But there's only one Court of Federal Claims. So if you're a corporation that's doing business across different state lines, you could have the same transaction having a different ruling depending on what district court you've gone through, right? And so what happens? You probably would want to go through the Court of Federal Claims so that you're getting the one decision, okay? And it's unlikely that and once you've gotten that decision, it's unlikely that one of the other district courts will start arguing with the Court of Federal Claims. And so if you're trying to get a broader decision that goes across different state lines, and et cetera, you're probably going to go to this U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and this is why I think some of the larger corporations would go through here, right? But if you've got a situation where you're like, hey, I'm a small business, my business is contained in, in the Bay Area, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go through the U.S. tax court, I'm going to go through the district court, and if I decide to appeal, then I'm appealing to what? The circuit court that is relevant geographically to my part of the country, okay? But notice they're at the same level here. Got to pay to go to either the U.S. Federal Court of Claims or the district court, U.S. tax court. Of course, you don't have to pay first, right? When you appeal, you go up to the circuit courts. There's one circuit court for the Court of Federal Appeals. It's a federal circuit, just one circuit, right? Okay, there are what? There are several regional, I think 9 regional circuit courts. And then if you get to this point where you are still disagreeing, maybe the Supreme Court will hear your tax case, although the Supreme Court does not have to take your case. So if you appeal to them, they could just say, we're not going to hear your case, right? So even though you could go ahead and appeal, they have the right to not hear your case. Okay, so probably it's going to stop here if you go that high. Okay? Any aspiring tax attorneys? Yeah? Okay, good. Where would you appeal? Depends, right? Again, it just really depends on the situation. I'm thinking if you want sort of the one stop, this is the way to go, okay, because it's going to have broader reaching through the U.S. Court of Federal Claims and the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. You know, when you get into some issues, you may want to research who's been more favorable in different, for different topics and that sort of thing, and that might guide how you go and how you file and go through. But it's important consideration, right? You want to file originally into the right court so that if you do want to appeal up a certain way, you're not locked in on the wrong side of the flow chart here. Okay, so I kind of think I said everything that's here, but let's just make sure our notes are reflecting some of the key points. Okay, so let's just look at this, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight here. I think I'm going to end up highlighting practically the whole page. Let me put it on highlighter. I said let me put it on highlighter. Okay, so the tax court here's only tax cases. Okay, right? And so the judges are going to have what? They're going to have more tax acumen, and they're probably going to be a little bit sympathetic, I would think, Yeah, I used to, hey, there's revenue agent that I used to work with. I used to go fishing with that guy, right? And now here he is, bringing you to tax court. Could be a little bit of a problem. I mean, I don't know. They should be unbiased. They should be biased, not unbiased. Okay, district court hears a wide variety of cases. Okay, so again, they are not specialists in tax law, so maybe that works for you, maybe that works against you. Okay, if we're talking about the Court of Federal Claims, okay, any claim against the United States, as I said, patent cases, those sort of things come a lot to this court. Okay, so it does hear non-tax litigation. There are therefore generalists. Okay, again, they are not specific to the tax. Okay, and it is viewed as a stronger option when we're talking about equity. In other words, what? That the transaction is being treated evenly across the different districts, etc., right? As opposed to a mere technical issue, okay? Or there's a lot of extensive discovery of evidence. You can see there's more sophistication there, and then probably an important point is there tends to be more of a business orientation, pro-business orientation. Again, to me, an important point is that you have to pay the deficiency if you want to go to the Court of Federal Claims or the District Court. Okay. So if you don't got the money, probably a good idea to do what? To go to the tax court, right? All right. Okay, so just some key points there. And you can see the number of judges. U.S. Tax Court, there's 19 judges sitting there. Okay, number of judges, 19. Court of Federal Claims, 16. District Court, it depends. Okay, and again, I think the key thing here is what? Do you have to pay? And it's no for the tax court. Okay, good. And this is the appeal process, guys. I'm not going to read these off. It's pretty clear. You go what? Circuit, Supreme, right? I mean, first you're dealing with the IRS, then you're going to the courts, tax court or district court or Court of Federal Claims, circuit courts, Supreme Court. Okay. Tax court decisions. Okay, when you have a tax court decision, you could have a regular or memorandum. Regular involve novel issues not previously resolved by the court. So for the first time, somebody's coming to the court and saying, I'm challenging the tax treatment for what IRS is saying is the proper tax treatment under the law for this transaction, and that sort of transaction has never been brought before the tax court before. They'll issue a decision on it so that now we can refer back to that if we have similar cases, right? If it's something that has been dealt with before, then that is going to be in a memorandum, and memorandum decisions we're going to see are not issued by the tax courts, okay? But the regular decisions are published, and they can be either temporary citation or permanent citation. Okay, if we have deal with memorandum, as again, it's for situations where it's already been established law, and these are not published. And I think it's because, if it was by already established law, what would happen? The tax court would have to be giving a decision for every single case, right, and issuing those, and they don't want to get into that. Okay, so it's just for novel areas. Okay, and you can see the citations here, how those would be cited. Okay, district court citations, Supreme Court decisions. Okay, tax treaties. What happens here? The federal government enters into tax treaties. Okay, and they do this to avoid double taxation. The idea being that what? I have a treaty with another country if I'm the United States, and we agree as to who will collect the tax for a particular transaction so that the taxpayer doesn't get taxed both by the U.S. and, again, say by another foreign government. Okay? And so in those situations, the they render a mutual assistance in tax enforcement, and they do not establish precedents, however. Okay, so when there's a direct conflict, the most recent item will take preference. Okay, so I guess they don't want to start World War III over a tax issue, I guess. Okay, okay, good. Tax research tools. Okay, and you know, you need to consider both electronic and paper. I'm thinking these days, what? The whole world is on the internet. Okay, so we're probably going to do electronic. Okay, and you have these tax research tools. There's a bunch of them. Okay, so those are really, to me, the place where you want to start when you're going through tax research. Okay, and so you start with those sources that we have over here when you're going through this research process. Where are they? Right here. You're going to be using those more because what? They have organized everything for you. So it's not like you're having to go back to the Federal Register and figure out, well, what day did they issue on this? What day did they issue on that? You can simply go to the tax services and take a look and probably do a one-stop shopping type situation. Okay, make sure you're tracking with the tax stuff. I know how fascinating this stuff is. Okay, but I can usually tell that you're not paying attention to the lecture when I see happiness on your face. Okay, so if I see smiles and enjoyment and light in your eyes, I know you're not paying attention to tax stuff. Okay, so when I stand up here, I'm looking at the individuals, and the person that is not doing what everybody else is doing stands out. And the reason is, I think it's a survival mechanism, right? In the jungle, the one guy who's doing something weird is the one that's probably getting ready to come kill you, right? So we tend to notice that. Okay, so you want to make sure and pay attention. Okay. All right. I know you can multitask, but keep it down to a mild roar. Okay. All right. So tax research process, and you're obviously going to have to identify the problem. Okay. Identify the problem, refine the problem, locate the appropriate tax law sources. Again, I'm thinking those tax services are probably the place to go, assess the validity, and arrive at the solution. Okay, we won't be doing any tax research in here, but nice to know what the process is. Okay, all right, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I know that we have some more of these things, but this starts to get a little deep for us. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and with the little bit of time we have left, let's take a look at the quiz. Chapter 2 quiz. It's a pretty easy quiz. Shouldn't take us too long to get through most of these if we start to run out of time. Okay, so tax bills are handled by which committee in the U.S. House of Representatives? And remember, we said it was what? The House Ways and Means Committee? How about in the Senate? Senate Finance. Okay, House Ways and Means, Senate Finance, right? Okay, and then of course it has to be signed by the president. Which of the following sources has the highest validity? Revenue ruling, revenue procedure, regulations, Internal Revenue Code, none of these. Code is the top, right? Okay. Highest tax validity is the code. Regulations are really kind of even, so that's not the best answer, because when an IRS agent looks at something, they're required to look at the code and the regulation. So they probably shouldn't have had regulations in here. Would have been a better answer. But the code is probably that's the U.S. code, so that probably is right. But I wouldn't have done it like that. I wouldn't give you that question on the test, because I don't want you to choose between the regs and the code. Obviously, those other ones, revenue rulings and revenue procedures, are going to be what? Below the code and the regs. Okay. Which statement is not true with respect to a regulation that interprets the tax law? It is not issued by Congress. It is going to be what? Issued by the Treasury Department, right? Congress issues the law. The IRS, essentially, Treasury Department, issues the reg. Okay, and of course, the reg can have more detail. Number 4, in the section 2121, the number 1 stands for the paragraph designation. I don't know that I'll give you anything like that either. Yeah, well, you should probably know what that means, so maybe I would give you something like that. So maybe you should look at that, okay? Because if you have a citation, you got to be able to find, well, where is it, right? So it might not hurt you to know that. Okay, take a look at number 5. Which regulations have the force and effect of law? And it is the what? Oh, we didn't do that. Okay. I think I went too quickly past that slide. On one of the slides dealing with regulations, we talk about procedural regulation, which is getting into things, how long do you have to file an extension, that sort of thing. We have the finalized regulations. We have legislative regulations. We have interpretive regulations. And so the legislative regulations are the ones that are going to have the force of law. Okay, these other procedural regs and interpretive regs are not going to be having the force of law. Okay, 6. Which of the following court decisions carries more weight? Federal District Court, Second Circuit Court of Appeals, U.S. Tax Court, Small Cases Division, U.S. Court of Federal Claims. It's going to be what? The Second Circuit Court of Appeals is the appeal court, right? You have what? You have the federal circuit and you have the regional circuits, but the circuit courts are the higher level, right? That's it. I think there's 9 circuit courts. Number 9, a jury trial is available in district court. I don't think we mentioned that. In the discussion there, the jury trial is only available in the district court. And you know what they say about a jury trial, right? Do you have to be tried by a jury? How do you decide? Is the person that's going on trial, can they decide whether they want a jury trial or a judge? You get to decide, don't you? So they say if you're innocent, choose a judge. If you're guilty, choose a jury. Okay, so maybe you're thinking, hey, you got a more populous case or something that you're trying to win. Maybe you go for the jury in the district court. But of course, you'd have to pay the tax. Okay, number 10, a taxpayer may not appeal a case from the what? Small case division. Can't appeal. And you're limited to the 50,000 threshold there? Okay. All right. Any question? Okay, so we're pretty much through with the chapter 2. Okay, you probably want to start to take a look at some of the homework. Oh, that was the other announcement I was wanting to make. So for Friday, Derek Garnes, who is our TA, is not going to be ready yet because I'm still trying to get him in to be able to pick out some of the homework assignments. But I've made it clear that that's got to happen by next Friday. So you can take a look at some of the homework questions for Chapter 2, et cetera, on your own. Put both test bank questions that are similar to these and homework questions. I'm thinking the test bank questions are the main thing to look at in terms of being prepared for your exams and stuff. And then next week, Derek will go through the homework, and it'll be Chapter 3 will be the focus of next week. Okay, and starting next week, we're going to really start getting into some of the nitty-gritty of filing status, how to determine gross income, how to determine taxable income, those sort of things. So we're going to start to get more into some of the nuts and bolts starting next week. All right? All right, guys, I will see you on Monday. No discussion on Friday.
So none of the homeworks are actually showing on.
Okay. Okay, I published those, but okay, I'll take another look and I'll put an announcement out as to why that's not happening. I know I hit the publish button, so I don't know why that's showing that.
Okay.
Okay, all right, thank you.